Mr. President, we've had a lot of action today in the United States Senate, which is unusual here. And I'd like to address that today. You know, I'd like to address this to the people of Texas, Louisiana, and all those that just experienced the devastating results and impact of Hurricane Harvey. Obviously, our hearts go out to those people, and of course we're going to do the right thing and help the people of Texas, which is just what we voted on today. But it's a bigger issue I want to speak to today, and I relate to this personally because just last year, almost exactly to the day, my family was evacuated from our home in South Georgia. And as I speak to you today, we were just notified today that my wife and mother-in-law, who are there today, will be evacuating this weekend from the south coast of Georgia, trying to get out of the way of the next hurricane, Hurricane Irma, which looks to be a very dangerous storm as well coming into Florida in the next day or so. But this crisis that we just saw in Texas and we might see in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina with the next hurricane, Hurricane Irma, reminds us of a bigger issue. It reminds us that because of our inability to get our financial house in order and the resultant debt crisis that we have today, we're losing the right to do the right thing. Whether it's medical research, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's education, whether it's funding our military. We'll deal with that next week, Mr. President. But we're losing the right to do the right thing. And by that I mean our own financial intransigence of the last really 16 years primarily. But I would say ever since 1965 when we had the Great Society and the Great War on Poverty, that has failed miserably, another great sweeping progressive liberal program that failed to make any dent in our poverty rate in the United States. The poverty rate today is fundamentally the same as it was in the days when that bill was signed into law. But because of our intransigence, our ability to appropriate money to deal with disasters like Hurricane Harvey and potentially Hurricane Irma and others before is in danger. Moving forward, we just simply will not be able to continue to deal with these emergencies and crises if we don't have a functioning federal government that actually pays its bills and has its financial house in order. The national debt actually is what pulled me into the political process. It's the reason I'm in the United States Senate today. The people of Georgia understood that this is an underlying crisis that we've been digging here for the last 2 decades and simply has to be dealt with. Today we have $20 trillion of debt. I call that a crisis, Mr. President, because we do not have a plan to reduce that back to some reasonable percentage of our GDP. This is greater in size than the size of our entire economy. And what's worse than that, what's more concerning is that over the next just 30 years, we have over $130 trillion by most estimates of future unfunded liabilities coming at us like a freight train. That's Social Security, Medicare, pension and benefits for federal employees, and the interest on the debt, primarily. Now here we are dealing with this debt ceiling just today, and I would argue the debt ceiling has been the most ineffective thing that I've seen in the United States Senate. Over 100 times it's been extended or increased, and it has not slowed down deficit spending in the United States Congress. It has not kept us from having a $20 trillion debt today. Washington knew this was coming, by the way. We've raised or suspended this debt over 100 times to no avail. It hasn't slowed down this debt, the debt spending that we've been doing particularly over the last 2 decades. 2 months ago in June, a group of senators and I enlisted the debt ceiling as one of the key reasons why we thought we ought to stay here during the month of August instead of going home and having our work period there, because we felt like this needed to be debated and we needed to get to a long-term solution. And exactly 3 months ago today, I stood right here in the United States Senate and laid out what I thought the real consequences of the debt would be. At that time, I said, and I quote, "Congress is the only enterprise I can find anywhere in the world that funds its operations the way we fund this government. The problem is we have a system that's absolutely, totally broken. It's a fraud that's being perpetrated on the American people," end quote. Mr. President, I stand by that today. The American people know that this is a fraud perpetrated on them, and that's why I think we've seen change in leadership in the White House here. And just 3 months later today, we see our debt limit today being dealt with in a way that puts in jeopardy our ability to deal with these national disasters like hurricanes and fires. We heard just a few minutes ago about the devastating fires in the Northwest. But let's be clear. The United States cannot and will not default on our debts. It will not default on our obligations. But this debt ceiling issue should have already been resolved much before now. We actually hit this debt ceiling, Mr. President, just so everybody remembers, in March of this year. The Secretary of Treasury has been using unusual measures, extraordinary measures they call them, to keep the government funding during this period of uncertainty. In fact, we hit this debt ceiling at a time when we should have been dealing with the budget. But, Mr. President, we still today, as I stand here today, we do not have a budget for FY18, and we have 15 days until the end of this fiscal year, the end of September this year, September 30th. Raising the debt ceiling now, just until December 15th, isn't what put our country at risk. The debt ceiling is not the issue here. It's not the problem. It's the unbridled spending that both parties have succumbed to in the last 2 decades under 2 presidents, one Republican, one Democrat. Our government has grown from $2.4 trillion to $3.9 trillion. That's constant dollars. Neither party can point fingers at the other in terms of the explosion in the size of the federal government. What's worse, as I just said, over the next 30 years, our mandatory expenses, not our discretionary spending in the last 9 years has come down largely because of the Budget Control Act and because of sequestration. Our discretionary spending has come down from about $1.5 trillion to just over $1 trillion last year. That $400 billion reduction, though, came on the back primarily and largely on our military. The debt ceiling has got to be dealt with, but it is not the driver of our problems. The budget process is the underlying release valve that causes this problem, and it allows both parties, particularly in the last 20 years, to spend money that we don't have. The budget process, as I've said before on this floor, has only worked 4 times in 43 years. We have to appropriate 12 bills a year to fund the federal government. Mr. President, the average over that 43 period is only 2.5. That's the fraud that's being perpetrated on the American people. I mean, no other body, no other entity that I can find anywhere in the world can get away with that. And yet here we are, kicking the can down the road again for another 3 months. Fixing the budget process alone will not solve the debt crisis, but we won't solve the debt crisis unless and until we fix this broken budget process. We cannot ignore this any longer. We must stop piling up this debt on the back of our kids and our grandkids. The fix is readily available. This debt crisis is not something that we can't solve. People say, well, you can't touch Social Security, you can't touch Medicare. Well, wait a minute. If we don't touch them, they're going to be broke in 14 short years. In 14 years, Mr. President, the trust funds of both Social Security and Medicare go to zero. Zero. People won't be up here changing, changing members of this body at the rate they are now. It will be much accelerated. But the fix can be done. There are 5 areas that need attention. And any of these areas can be bipartisan solutions. I won't go into detail today. I'll just highlight the 5 areas. But we have got to deal with each one of these on their own merits. The budget process, I just said, is broken, can be fixed. And I believe we have right now behind the scenes Democrats and Republicans working together to find a bipartisan, politically neutral platform to argue our arguments on both sides of the budget process to create a budget that actually funds the federal government appropriately without all this drama and without the release valve of extra spending. The second thing is redundant spending. We know that the GAO, the General Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office both agree that we have several $100 billion of redundant agencies and redundant programs. The third is grow the economy. This is job one by this president. This president has said job one of his administration this year is to do the things in the regulatory environment and the tax environment to grow the economy. The fourth area is to save Social Security, not cut it, save Social Security and save Medicare. That can be done. And I believe there are bipartisan alternatives that we should be debating right now. But you know, Mr. President, in 2.5 years, that has not come before this body and I don't see it happening the balance of this year. The fifth area is, while we've debated health care most of this year, we debated the insurance side of health care for the individual market and Medicaid. What we never talked about, and haven't under President Obama, under President Bush, and now even under President Trump, under this Congress, we have not dealt with the spiraling drivers of health care costs themselves. Health care delivery, pharmaceuticals, and the fact that the neediest among us are getting the most expensive care in emergency rooms today unnecessarily. Don't be misled. We're well into this debt crisis. This is not something that can be solved in a 10-year planning horizon. This is something that we need to tell the bond market and the world that we are committed to a 20 or 30-year period in order to fix this debt crisis. Ideas are coming from both sides of the aisle. One side comes from the Democratic side that says, look, let's pick a time in the future, put a stake in the ground about what target percentage of GDP our debt should be, and to develop a roadmap between today and that point in time in the future to commit ourselves to get there. I applaud that idea, Mr. President. I think that is a genuinely brilliant idea. It's something that other countries have done before us. It's something that can work. But colleagues, please remember, today every dollar we spend in our country's defense, that's about $600 billion directionally correct in our military, between 150 and 200 billion for our veterans, and then all domestic discretionary spending, about $1.1 trillion, Mr. President. Every dime of that is borrowed money. Let me say that again. Every dollar we're spending on our defense, every dollar we spend on our veterans, and every dollar we spend on our discretionary domestic programs, like what we're doing here today, is borrowed money. This simply cannot continue, Mr. President. I can't think of any taller order between now and the end of the year as we debate the tax changes that we want to make to our tax code so we can become competitive with the rest of the world. Let's remember why we're debating that tax issue. We're debating the tax issue to become competitive with the rest of the world, to grow the economy. That's one of 5 areas that need to be dealt with. Our regulatory work is the other area in that attempt to grow the economy. But we will not dig out of this debt crisis unless and until we fix our budget process, stop this redundant spending, save Social Security and Medicare, and fix the spiraling nature of our health care costs. Mr. President, I can think of nothing in our future the rest of this year that's more important than addressing this budget process as we look at tax and dealing with this long-term debt crisis that we have.